Oh, Jorge, I am so sorry. I have no idea what was going on, but it would not let me start this meeting. Can you
Hello,
hear me
can you hear me?
okay? Yes, can you hear me okay? Can you not
Can
hear
you
me?
hear anything that I'm saying?
Uh, I can hear you. You can't
There you
hear.
go. I'm here. I can hear. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, we're good to go. I'm so sorry.
Very
Were
good. There you go.
you long?
Tell me again.
Were you in the waiting room long?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. My
No,
computer
that's okay.
was not letting me start it.
That's okay. The background, should I blur it out? Is there a
Oh, you're
background noise?
fine. Whatever makes you comfortable.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Once you're ready, I'll let everyone in for you and then you'll be good to go.
We're good to go.
All right. Fabulous. Let me admit all and I will disable your waiting room.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good
Good
afternoon.
afternoon.
I can hear you. I can just ask you if you guys can mute yourselves, please, so we don't get the background noise. There you go. Thank you.
Remember when I said that Tulin's condition could
There are a
affect
couple of more. If I can ask you guys to please mute yourselves. Mute.
mine wasn't. Oh, I hear myself.
There we go. That should be good. Okay, awesome. So welcome. My name is Jorge Ramirez. I will be your presenter for today. And today we are going to talk about one of the things as teachers, I think it's those things that really don't come up in our studies as we are, no worries, as we go into our profession, and it's always a hot topic to talk about is children's behavior. And I've done some extensive research on behavior. I've done a lot of presentations on it as well. And I'm going to share with you some tips that I've learned throughout my experience. Here's my information. There's a QR code there. Feel free to scan it. That'll give you access to my information. If you have any questions, if you want to follow up with the conversation with me, please email me at the email provided. You can also reach out to me via LinkedIn, which is where this QR code will take you. So I have a lot of roles that I play in my career. This is just to name a few. And if there's if you want to connect later, have a conversation about some questions that you might have, please feel free to do so. So let's jump into our conversation. Conversation is about challenging behaviors, and I'm curious to know to you. Please use the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like. Um, what what do you constitute as a challenging behavior? What do children do that you feel, this is something that's challenging, maybe I need some help, maybe I need some support? Anything that you might say, this is deemed as a challenging behavior. Constant hitting. Simone, I see your hand. Go ahead.
And then I put your stuff in the fridge.
Over talking.
You guys want to
Over
grab more cake with you guys?
over talking.
Take with you. Don't leave anything for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna mute Marisa, muted her. Okay. Constant hitting, over talking. Okay, anything else? Oops.
The very loose boundaries with other children.
Boundaries. That's very important. We'll hit on that through our conversation about boundaries. Using bad words. Oh, that's from Vicky. Hi, Vicky. Thank you for joining. Being disruptive. Okay. Anything else? Anything that comes to mind? Behavior struggles during transitions throughout the day. Yes. Thank you, Alejandra. So here's the thing about challenging behaviors, and it really depends on who you ask. They're going to give you a different definition of what a challenging behavior is. If you ask me, throughout my career, I have 24 years of experience. I started in the education field right out of high school, and I have a different tolerance into what a challenging behavior is. Now, what I'm going to present to you, it's not at the beginning, and though it's through my research, through my experience, my own independent studies with children, that I've concluded that there's more to that. What I want to do in this conversation is I want to shift your mindset about what is a challenging behavior, because I think a lot of the times what children want to do is, let me just mute some people. Thank you. What as we have this shifting of the mind into how we see children's behavior, I wanted to try to get a big scope, the big picture into what the children are doing, into why are they doing what they're doing, why are they behaving the way they're behaving, and also, oops, something happened there. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So, how are children feeling when they start to behave the way that we deemed as challenging behavior? The behaviors that they're doing, what I want us to do is I want us to try to be as objective as we can when we're labeling these challenging behaviors. So I'm going to use the chat as an example to see, okay, is this more objective or is it more subjective? Hitting. We all know what hitting looks like, right? We can all agree that hitting is a physical action against another child. Whether or not it's intentional, that's a whole different conversation. Behavior attitudes. What does that look like? Using bad words. Well, what do you deem as bad words? Are we talking about more of the disrespectful bad words? Are we talking more about a word that in your culture can be seen as a bad word, but in other culture, it means something completely different? So the curse words, okay, cursing words, that's, again, I had this experience where a child said a word, but in their culture, in their home language, it meant a fruit, where in my Mexican culture, it was a very disrespectful, bad word used against a male. So it was like, wait, so context, right? We'll talk more about that. What we want to do is we want to look at children as individuals instead of having this big umbrella into what a challenging behavior is. Try to get more context into why is Jorgito behaving that way? What is Jorgito doing that's making him behave that way? Or why is he choosing those behaviors? Understand that children, they don't all express their emotions the exact same way as we do. Some of them have more tolerance. Some of them resort to being physically aggressive towards other children, while others might just absorb it all in, go home and talk about it. However that happens, I want us to have this understanding that children all behave very differently, and they're all going to express their emotions very differently as well. In some cases, some of the transitions that we have in the classroom might be triggers for these children that might respond a certain way. The group that I currently work with is 3 and 4 year olds, older 3 and early 4 year olds. And I have a child, Jorgito, who doesn't like the term clean up. So whenever we started using that as part of our transitions, we would trigger him, not intentionally because we weren't aware of it, but the more we started to pay attention into, notice this transition, but when we realize, wait, it's clean up, because when we use, let's put the toys away, Jorgito cooperates. So I want us to have some reflection into what we are saying and how we are saying it. Is it possible that we might be triggering them to behave a certain way? And then the last thing that I want you to really think about is your expectations. What are your expectations based on the child's expectations? Are they reality? Are they something that's developmentally appropriate? And we'll have this conversation tomorrow if you're going to join us. When children behave a certain way, Dr. Gabor Mate, who talks about early childhood education, he talks about trauma, he talks about adverse childhood experiences. He asked, does our culture, our biases, and our own understanding of behavior influence our expectation with children's behavior? Something for you guys to think about. You have access to the PowerPoint, you have access to the agenda on the portal. When you log in, make sure you download these files if you want, or you can always shoot me an email and I will gladly get them to you. I want to reiterate what you've heard, everyone, and I'm sure you tell it to yourself every single morning. All children are good. Dr. Kennedy talks about parenting and how we can shift our mindset from our cultural expectations of child rearing versus focusing on the child individually. And what she concludes in her research is that children want to be accepted, they want to be loved, and they want to be heard. I'm going to take it a step further and say that I think all of us adults, that's exactly what we want too. So through this reflection conversation, let's start right away. How do you feel or how do you respond when you are not accepted by a group of peers? Maybe a job that you applied to and you didn't get it. Maybe a university you're trying to get into. Maybe you just want to have the sense of acceptance, but you're not getting that. How do you respond to that? Children want to be loved just as much as we do. If you've gone through a bad breakup anytime in your life, you know how heartbreaking that is. Children want to be heard. So imagine coming into work, you have this great idea that you thought about, you research that you've applied, and you say, this is going to work great. And you come into your boss's office and you say, I have this great idea. Nope, I need you to go to your class and I need you to get started in your work. Yeah, but I think that I might be able, no, go to your class and get to work. I know you don't do that, but unfortunately, the reality is that sometimes we are caught up with our routines, we are caught up with curriculum, we are caught up with transitions, that we might lose touch into hearing what the child is saying. So again, through this reflection conversation, I want you to really have that in mind. Children want to be accepted, children want to be loved, and children want to be heard. Every single type of behavior, you can list it on the chat, you can think about it, you can write it in your notes. It is called a behavior. Behavior is learned. We need to really understand that. When children come to the classroom, maybe using bad words, as we said, constantly hitting, maybe not following instructions, the child learned that one way or another. And in their perspective, the way they view the world, they saw the consequences and they said, you know what, I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to mimic that behavior without really understanding it. Part of my experience include working with children with that have an individualized education plan, IEP. And I had Jorgito in the classroom that whenever I would call his name, he would respond to me with a Spanish bad word. And at first, the adults laughed about it. So Jorgito thought, oh, okay, I don't even know what that word is. But based on the reinforcement, I think they liked it. So the next time they say, hey, Jorgito, and he responds the exact same way and he gets the exact same reaction, what do you think he's going to want to do? This is what B.F. Skinner talked about, behaviorism. They learn best through positive reinforcement, but children young really can't see the difference between positive or negative. What they see is a response, and what they want is that response. So whenever they get a response, whether it be good or bad, in their eyes, they're going to keep doing that because they know that I'm going to get a response. Now, Albert Bandura, another researcher in our field, talks about social learning theory, and then he breaks that up into social cognitive theory. But I want to focus on social learning theory. And he's best known through the bubble doll experiment, where they place a child in front of a one-way mirror. On the other side of the mirror was an adult behaving very aggressively with the bubble doll, punching this doll, showing expressions that the child interpreted as aggressive, looked down on it and did this behavior. And there was no interaction between the adult or the child. The only thing was that the child was looking at the adult. So then the child was placed with the bubble doll. And how do you think the child responded? The child responded the exact same way the adult was. And thus he came up with social learning theory. Children will learn based on other people's behavior, and then they'll interpret that and say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So when children are misbehaving, it's not that they're sitting there trying to concoct this plan into saying, how am I going to torture my teacher today? It's more of like, yesterday, when I was in the sandbox, I saw Jorgito throwing sand at Brianna. And Brianna started crying. And then the teacher took Jorgito and sat him down with her. And they read a book together. I want that attention too. What is this child likely to do? This is exactly what children go through based on the research, based on brain development and learning. and behaviorism that they think, oh, that's what I have to do to get that type of attention. So keep that in mind when children are doing certain behaviors that maybe you're not okay with. Ask yourself, let me get more context. Let me take a step back and try to understand where all this is coming from. Challenging behaviors with an attachment approach, and that's where the shifting of the mind, where I want to get to in this conversation. Yes, challenging behaviors I know can be very stressful in the classroom. They might pose some risk to children, but if it at any point it involves the safety of the child or anyone else, then obviously you have to intervene and you have to provide what's best for the children, because safety is always the top priority. But sometimes we are carrying our own load, right? And sometimes our own biases, our own cultural expectation, and our own way of seeing things might influence into how we are going to address that behavior. What I want to do is I want to help us all understand that if we give children a sense of belonging in our classroom, if children feel respected, they feel loved, and they feel heard, 99% sure that this child is going to want to please you. You ask the child to go ahead and clean up. You ask the child to go help someone else. You ask the child to do the work. I am almost certain that if you have this sense of belonging, the child is probably going to want to please you. Now, I also want you to understand that this doesn't just apply in the classroom. This also applies at home. Whenever there's a clash with the parent and the child, we tend to engage in this power struggle. And this power struggle is 99% also certain that you're going to lose that power struggle, because you're probably going to get upset. You're probably going to get frustrated. And you're probably going to tell the child what to do, when to do, and how to do it. That doesn't give them that sense of belonging. We want to have that sense of belonging as well. We want to be respected. We want to be loved, and we want to be heard. Within that, we need to find a way to make our emotional expressions a norm. Tell them how you feel. I was just out in the yard with the children, and there was Jorgito, who was trying to be part of the baking in the sand with Brianna and Joy. And Brianna and Joy said, "We don't need any help right now. We'll call you if we need help." But Jorgito doesn't understand those boundaries. So Jorgito went in there and he just started flipping the cakes over. And Brianna and Joy got really upset. And they told him, "No, stop, I don't like it." And then Jorgito walked away. I called Jorgito over and I told Brianna and Joy, when you tell him you don't like it, but Jorgito doesn't know what it is, you can't assume that he's going to understand what you're talking about. Tell him what you don't like. And then Brianna looked at Jorgito and said, "I don't like you messing up my cakes." And that gave Joy a sense of empowerment. And Joy said, I don't like you coming in to the bakery when we said you can't come in." Boundaries, right? Now, Jorgito understood what he did wrong, because he said, "Oh, okay." And then he asked me, "Can I get some water for my sand?" "Yes. What's your plan?" "Oh, you want to make your own bakery?" "Great, go for it." Because he wants this sense of belonging. He wanted to be accepted by the children. He wasn't following their boundaries. So now Jorgito said, "Okay, well, I can't be here." But Brianna and Joy were able to articulate their emotions. It's a norm in the classroom to say why you're frustrated, not just the feeling, but also explain to your friends why you're feeling that way. Because for all I know, maybe I said something and I wasn't even aware that I hurt your feelings. But if you tell me you don't like it, please don't assume that I know what it means. That our goal as educators is we are always going to accept children, regardless of their behavior. Growing up, I was the one that had the healthiest immune system, and I had the perfect attendance because my parents had to work. My parents had to send us to school to make sure that we got fed, to make sure that we got educated. So the one that was torturing and terrorizing the teachers, that was Jorgito. And the mistake that I see now in retrospect is that the teachers didn't accept me. I was labeled without the teachers understanding, well, what's causing Jorgito to behave this way, more when we get into that. Like I mentioned before, children want to be loved. And as educators, as teachers, it's part of what we do to make sure that children feel that love. Here's Jorgito, el tremendo, as my mom and my dad would call me. Jorgito is one of 8 children. I'm the second oldest. And in the middle here, you see some of the qualities that I have. Thank you, Simone. All these things, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? All these things equate to anger. And why anger? Anger because in my culture, very traditional Mexican machismo, not allowed to express any anger. As a boy, I was allowed to show aggression and anger, but then I had to get over it. So if teachers disrespected me, if my friends didn't accept me, if I didn't feel love at home, I could get angry or I can be aggressive, but then I got to get over it. So how do you expect Jorgito to grow up, go to school, and be successful when he's not loved, he's not heard, and he's not accepted? When we start labeling children's behavior, which happened to me a lot, children feel that and they understand that, oh, yeah, they just don't want me to be part of. One of my great mentors, Manuel Caldera, he would always tell me a lot. Children are very intuitive. They know, they can feel you. And I've learned that through experience, that whenever I had Jorgito in my classroom and I accepted him, he would only come to me when he needed help. He didn't go to the other teachers, nothing against the other teachers that I worked with, but he said, you know what? You accept me. You understand me. So when the other teachers weren't able to get him to line up, get him to clean up, get him to cooperate or keep his hands to himself, and I would come in, the way that we communicated with him was very different. And a lot of it stemmed from my theoretical approach in working with children using attachment. How do I help Jorgito feel love? How do you behave when you feel loved? How do you behave when you feel heard? And how do you behave when you feel part of something? Think of a class that you've taken at one point or another in your academic career. Think of a class where you didn't have that sense of belonging. You weren't necessarily accepted or heard. How did you perform? And then think of a class where you had a good connection with your teacher. You were heard, you felt love, you felt welcome, you felt part of the class. How did you perform? I can assure you that there's a difference in your performance just based on how you felt in the classroom. And as educators, as teachers, it is our responsibility to welcome these children, to welcome everything that they're carrying. Because you never know, you might have Jorgito in your classroom and all he wants is to be loved, to be accepted, and to be heard. More on Jorgito as we go on. As a child and as an adult, one of my biggest struggles in life is I have a lot of anger inside of me. Don't worry, you guys are okay. Gone through therapy, had great therapists in my life that have done a lot of reflection, a lot of great conversations like the one we're having today. That has helped me understand that the anger that I dealt with as a young child has nothing to do with anyone else. It has everything to do with me finding a way to let it out. I don't drink soda, but just imagine this was a soda bottle. What happens to this soda bottle as you shake it? And then you shake it more, and then you upside down and you shake it. Think of this being Jorgito as a child where he goes to school, he's not loved, he goes with his friends, he's not accepted, and he goes home and he's not heard because there's 8 other children in the home. Eventually, when this bottle opens, what's going to happen? Where is all that anger going to go? Assuming that Jorgito doesn't accept the fact that there's great resources like mental health specialists, therapists, what have you, that's going to help him vent out those emotions. It's probably going to lead to a lot of misbehaviors. So our approach into working with children moving forward after this conversation with you all is to develop a good understanding into what attachment theory talks about. Two great researchers, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, they both talk about having an emotional bond with the caregiver. Bowlby talks about a secure base for children. So when there's an emotional bond, there's a secure base, children tend to explore with their behavior. And they tend to develop these boundaries with that caregiver. Now, obviously, if the caregiver is able to facilitate those boundaries in a healthy way, then you're probably going to get that better desired behaviors outcome as opposed to having inconsistency. What Mary Ainsworth talked about was attachment styles. She talks about secure attachment, anxious attachment, anxiety, and fearful. The goal based on Bowlby is to have that secure base. When you have a secure attachment style with children, then they're less likely to be avoidant and they're less likely to feel anxious. So let's put that on ourselves. How do you behave when you're anxious? How do you feel when there's a high level of stress? How do you behave when you feel that this is just way overwhelming? Can you perform at your peak? And you're an adult. Now imagine going back and thinking, how would Jorgito at 3 or 4 or 5 years old, how would he respond to this? Jorgito doesn't have the tools to articulate his emotions. Jorgito doesn't have the resources to understand attachment because he's too young. Because he's also dependent on adults. And if adults are not giving him these tools to help him, then where do you think his emotions are going to go? Probably to misbehavior. How we understand challenging behaviors has a lot to do with focusing on the whole child. So we can't look at a whole class and say we're looking at the whole child because every single child is different. Every single child is unique. I always like to refer to my children that I work with superstars because every single star in the universe is unique. Every single star in the universe is beautiful. And every single star in the universe, we always admire. So imagine having that mindset with every single child that you're working with. That's how you start developing this idea of focusing them as the whole child. Can't compare you. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. I'm not going to have unrealistic expectations. I'm going to try to help and understand, is my routines triggering you to behave a certain way that now I deemed as a challenging behavior? What are your expectations for children? So let's use the chat, or you guys can raise your hand. Unmute. Use the chat, or you guys can raise your hand, unmute yourselves, and tell me, what are your expectations for children in the preschool classroom? Your expectations for children in the classroom. What do you want them to do? Who's that? Simone, please talk to us.
Hi. My expectations is to not have any. Because when you have expectations, you get anxious, worried, and especially when you're a teacher and learning, knowing all these things about the milestones, and you're expecting for your kids to follow every single milestone on time. If they don't, something's wrong. And even, with older kids, you really think that the older kids are just set in their ways and they're just going to be the same. And that's not true. We're always, even as adults, we shouldn't even have expectations for adults either, but definitely not for children.
Okay. Not having any expectations. Okay. Anybody else? Thank you, Simone. Anyone else? To listen and follow directions. Follow directions, be nice to each other. Want them to engage and teach me new ways to view the world. To be well behaved, learn how to be respectful of themselves and others, respect each other. Anybody else want to jump in the conversation? So Here's be kind and have fun. I usually tell the kids all the time, have fun. Don't forget to have fun. Expect them to be children. Oh, I like that. Do we have an understanding into what children's behaviors are? We have a good idea into, children are going to bite. We don't want them to bite, but we understand that they will bite. Children are going to push the boundaries. We don't want them to, but we understand that they will. So here's the question to you all, and please unmute yourselves. Give us your thoughts on this, or use a chat. Do you have realistic expectations for children's development in the class? Whatever it is that you expect from them, is that realistic? Simon, please talk to us.
No, we are not realistic with the child's behavior because we don't look at them, like you said, as just one child. We're looking at the entire classroom, especially since money's involved. If your entire school is performing at their very best, then you get more money and all these other things, when not every kid is going to perform great. Not every kid is going to do what the next kid did. And that when we're not realistic with their behavior, they can have bad attachment styles, because then they're thinking, well, since I'm not doing what Tommy did, then I must be completely wrong.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna pick one of these examples. I'm gonna use Slauson Occupational Center. So you put to listen and follow directions, to use their words. Let's start with the first one. To listen and follow directions. If a child has never been to a preschool setting, a child comes into your classroom for the first time, and are you showing them what listening looks like? Are you showing them what following directions look like? Or is this an expectation that we have when they come in? Oh, you should know how to do this. Use their words. I like that, and I encourage all the children to use their words, but what if their words not English? What if their words is mumbling because developmentally they haven't fully developed their language yet? One of my experience working with Jorgito was teachers would constantly tell him, use your words, use your words, use your words, and his words were not appropriate. So I would say, don't encourage him to use his words because he's going to disrespect you. If you haven't modeled to Jorgito what appropriate communication looks like, can you expect for him to be respectful? If you haven't modeled how to have conversations with children, can you expect for them to have proper words? If you don't model how to be sympathetic or empathetic, then how do you expect for them to do that? Now, I'm not having a conversation about that's a parent responsibility, that's a teacher's responsibility, that this is not the conversation. The conversation is as teachers, as educators, when children come into our classroom, it is our responsibility, it is our duty to scaffold them, to get them to meet those developmental milestones. But if we're not doing that, if we're not getting to the fundamentals of this is what using your words mean, tell them how you feel. I don't even know how I feel. Then you can't expect children to magically come up with these words and articulate words that to you have meaning, but to them they don't, because they just haven't gotten there yet. So the question now comes, again, are we realistic with our children's behavior? Simon, go ahead, see your hand. Simon, were you gonna add something?
Oh, yes.
There you go.
That, like you said, scaffolding, we need to be spending more one-on-one time with the children that are having difficulties. But with that, most teachers aren't getting paid enough to do that. you know.
Okay, hold on. Let me jump right in. And that's a whole other conversation.
Oh,
If if you apply for a job
mm,
and you know what the salary is,
mm,
and you take that job,
mm.
can you turn around and tell that employer this isn't enough?
No.
No, knowing that you knew exactly how much you were going to get paid to what to do. You knew exactly what your responsibilities were going to be, and that is developing children if you're coming into early childhood education field. If you know that, can you continue to complain about we're not getting paid enough, we're not getting paid enough? I've had people tell me that, and I say to them, then why do you even take this job? If you know it's not enough for you, and enough looks very different to people, but we can't say, I wasn't expecting to have Jorgito in my classroom with these challenging behaviors when it's like, no, because you didn't know Jorgito, but there are ways for us to work with children. There are ways for us to really understand what we need to provide for them to help them get to that stage. And part of that, it's the name of our field, child development. We
Mhm.
develop these children. We should be scaffolding. We should be modeling. We should be having these conversations with them to help them understand how to do it. Do we get paid enough? No, because you know what? We can get paid $1 million a year, and I assure you, it's
Still
still
won't.
not going to be enough.
No, it won't.
Yeah, but
think-
thank you, Simon. Let's go.
I
Let's go
think
with
with that,
Daniel.
oh,
Let's go with Daniel, and then we'll go to Jessica. Daniel, go ahead. Thank you for being here.
Well,
By the way, I appreciate you.
my pleasure. Well, from having worked with both in a classroom and as a home visitor, one of the things that I realized when you're having again expectations for children, because it's normal. Even though we might not say we have expectations or whatever, there's still something within us that want the children to either do, follow, whatever. I think the key two key components to having expectations or proper expectations are patience and time, which is something that I realized a lot of parents don't have of patience and the time to let the child learn and go through the trial and error of trying to execute whatever it is that that expectation is. Again, if you have the expectation, know what it takes for that child to get to that point. And being realistic, I mean, a lot of parents unfortunately don't have that time or the patience because they have 3 other kids or 4 other kids. They have to go to practice, they have to go pick up the store, go to the dry cleaning, whatever may be the situation. So I think patience and time are crucial to being able to execute or have the child learn and progressively move on with that expectation.
Very good points. Thank you, Daniel. Completely agree with you. I'm hearing you speak. You trigger me when you said there's other children. There was 8 of us. There is 8 of us, and when I wanted that attention as a child, I just wanted that hug. Aside from my birthday, I just wanted that. Good job, Jorge. And I wasn't getting it. But now as an adult, I completely understand because I see the big picture. As a parent myself, I understand that having more than one child can be challenging because you have to find a way to divide yourself up. And if I don't know how to manage that, then of course I'm going to see whatever the Jorgito did was not appropriate. But thank you for sharing, Daniel. Really appreciate you. Jessica, go. I see your hand.
Yes, uh, I want to say something that's well, back to the point that for paying, for the pay, of course we know
That's
that.
another word, Shava. Go on.
No, I just really want to share this one. Yes, because that's what I always confuse that why some teacher act that way. Because when you pick a career as the teacher, that means you have something inside you, the passion that you want to do something for the children to get them to be a good person or something like that.
Mhm.
Yes, so just right on point that is something is trigger me. You can say that, okay, this is what I really
Yeah.
want to say. Of course, it's not relevant to what we're going to be, but it's also related to the challenging behavior because you don't
Yes.
care. You show the children you don't care.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that, Jessica.
Just a little bit.
No, you know the point that you said is it's perfectly clear is if your calling is to be a teacher and you become a teacher, then follow that calling, whether it's $1 million a year or whatever it is that we get paid. If that's what you want to do, then that's part of the package, right? And part of the package also includes the opportunity to change society, and that's priceless. If we really focus on that opportunity to change society through the way we're educating and developing children, man, I would take that any day. I would gladly do that for free. To overcome challenging behaviors, there's two parts to it based on the research that I've done. The first part is acknowledging emotions. And the reason why I say that is because as an adult, as carrying so much, when I find days to unload and compartmentalize some of my emotions, I feel myself to be more effective. I feel myself having this fire inside of me, this, I got this. Sort of like what I'm feeling coming up here as I left the children in the yard. Said, okay, I'm gonna go upstairs and have a workshop. I'll see you guys in a bit. It was that, okay, I know they're safe. I know my staff's there working with them. As I'm coming up here, I'm thinking, this is gonna be a great conversation, right? And I'm feeling this way because I've learned to compartmentalize these things. But with young children, if we're not acknowledging those emotions, if we're not allowing them to acknowledge those emotions, they're going to be carrying so much. I tell my children all the time in sign language, all my feelings are okay. And it's so gratifying when parents come to the class and they say, well, yeah, I was really upset, but Brianna told me all my feelings are okay, Mom. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're so true. And it makes a lot of sense. Yes. Here you have a 3, 4, 5-year-old telling you that, acknowledging your emotions, and it makes you feel good because your feelings were validated. Imagine what you can do to a child. Imagine Jorgito found a way to articulate his emotions throughout his life. Now as an adult, might have better ways, better strategies when he's feeling overwhelmed with anger, with joy, with sadness, with disgust, with fear, what have you, because he acknowledges those emotions. Finding a way to empower children to label their own emotions. Father Greg Boyle, in one of the books that he wrote, he talks about children are egocentric. If they are the most important person in their life, children can have healthier social skills. Children can be more likely to have positive esteem and high self-efficacy when they find ways to articulate their emotions. Now imagine that. How would that work for you if you found ways to let your emotions come out? Imagine you're driving on the freeway and somebody cuts you off. Hopefully it wasn't me, but just imagine whoever cuts you off. How do you respond? Don't tell me. Don't put it on the chat either. That's just for you to reflect. What happens if there's a big accident on the freeway and now you're late to work? How do you respond? What happens if you snooze way too many times and now you're late for work or for class? What happens if you studied really hard and somehow you still bomb the test? How does that make you feel? When we don't know how to properly vent or acknowledge our emotions, it's a time when those emotions are going to overtake us. And as an adult, I struggle with that a lot. A lot of it has to do with my nervous system responding this way because throughout my childhood, it was suppress those emotions, suppress those emotions, suppress those emotions. I've shared this with a lot of my friends, and I'll share it with you guys all. I'm not afraid to talk about my emotions anymore. I honestly feel like if I need to have a good cry, really good cry with tears, and snot coming out of my nose, and just letting everything out. The problem is that I don't know how, because my nervous system has been conditioned to feeling this way automatically shut off. Because as a child, I was never allowed to acknowledge my emotions. So what happens now as an adult, my boundaries get blurred. My boundaries get really blurred because I don't acknowledge my emotion, because now those emotions are overtaking me and I'm not at my homeostasis level, that now I'm overreacting, I'm over-exaggerating. I'm lashing out at people that I love. I'm hurting people that have absolutely nothing to do with my anger. if I ever get to that point, I'm going to share that all over social media. I finally cried. I just don't know how. Part 2 of understanding challenging behaviors or overcoming challenging behaviors is developing healthy boundaries. And boundaries is something that we need to get it clear before we even jump into that. Boundaries is when we tell someone what we will do, but we're not requiring anything from them. Dr. Kennedy described this as, this is not negotiable. I'm telling you what my boundary is. You don't have to do it, but you have to respect my boundary. Now, if you're on the other side of that, it can sound a little standoffish, right? But if you're the one that's establishing that boundary, it sounds powerful. Imagine young children having the ability to say, I need my space right now. I don't want to talk right now. I need to go and cry, and then I'll come back and talk to you. Imagine if a child has the ability to articulate to you, I'm not ready to talk right now. Boundaries are we win, not I'm going to win and you're going to lose, or vice versa. No, we're all going to win when we have healthy boundaries. These healthy boundaries consist of not engaging in a power struggle, because like I said, you're going to lose that power struggle with children. It's not threatening. It's not saying, if you do this, I'm going to do that, because that's a threat. And that will lead into a power struggle. It's respectful. You are respecting the child as a whole. You are respecting Jorgito, that he doesn't have the words to articulate how he's feeling. That he's not misbehaving because he doesn't like the children, or he doesn't know how to share, or he doesn't know how to interact. It's that he doesn't know. And you take this in a very calm, very monotone poker face. Don't dictate what the child should be feeling. You know, I see you're very upset, so I'm going to take this away from you until you go to the timeout chair and you think on the thinking chair. And you're going to sit there, and you're going to think, and then come back, and then we're going to talk. That already violated all the expectations of developing healthy boundaries. You don't dictate how anyone else feels. Sure, you can influence certain people's emotions, but if you're dealing with Jorge, not Jorgito, I am not going to allow you to control my emotions. I am not going to relinquish my power to control my emotions. Now, that took a lot of work, but we're talking about 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. We empower them at a young age so they can say, I control my emotions. Your boundaries are direct, they're firm, and they're guaranteed. So please don't tell them, we're not going to go to Disneyland. And then I see your Instagram post and you're all over Disneyland. That's not going to do it. That is not healthy. When you're establishing these boundaries, you're not asking for their approval. So you really need to think about it. In other words, you need to find a way to really be at a state of mind where, okay, this is what's best for the child based on the research, based on what I know, based on understanding Jorgito, because this is going to get us to connect with each other to help you understand that desired behavior as opposed to that behavior that's not productive to you or anyone else in the classroom. I get this question asked a lot, so I'd figure before we go to the Q&A, let's talk about classroom management. I've had individuals in the past that would ask, so what does your classroom management looks like? And instantly it's, well, healthy relationships with kids. Wait, but like, what do your rules look like? That's not part of classroom management. Because as this quote says, you can have the right rules, but if you don't have the right relationships, you're not going to get anywhere. The speed limit says whatever it is, right? But sometimes I don't see the speed limit intentionally because I feel that, you know what, right now it's safe to go a little bit faster, so let's just go a little bit faster. Sometimes I feel, I know that's the rule, but I don't think that's safe for me, so I'm not going to follow that rule. But if it's coming from someone that I have an emotional bond with, someone that I genuinely know loves me, hears me out, and accepts me, I'm probably going to listen to that a whole lot more. How do you manage your class? How are you going to manage the classroom that you're going to go into? How is the classroom where you're sitting at right now, if you're in class? What does it look like? Is it a space for you to really talk about how you're feeling? Maybe you don't understand the assignment and you have the opportunity to ask questions and you feel that good connection with your teacher to say, you know what? My teacher's not going to ridicule me. My teacher's going to help. Are the rules that you have for the children in the classroom, are they rigid and unrealistic? Because go back to what I said earlier. Sometimes our routines can trigger children's behavior. Here's some strategies for reflection. When you're developing your healthy boundaries with the children, a way for them to acknowledge their emotions, try to take this, it's on, like I said, it's on the PowerPoint, it's slide number 11 when you access it. And if you don't, you can have, if you can't find access to it, send me an email and I'll gladly send it over to you. But I really want you to take this in mind. Separate the child from the behavior. Yes, Jorgito bites his friends because he gets really upset and he doesn't know how to talk because he doesn't have the language, because there's a developmental delay. That doesn't make him bad. That just tells me that I need to help Jorgito separate his behavior from him. In my mind, I know you can't speak, but the behavior that you're doing, biting, that's unacceptable because now you're hurting someone else. Ask them questions. What's the reason for the biting? And try to avoid the whys, because as we know, children, that's the last WH question they really understand is why. They'll ask you a million times, why, but they're not going to be able to answer that question. But rather shift your question. It's the reason for the biting. Same thing as asking why you biting, you're just shifting the words. You want children's behavior to change, then you have to be willing to model it. Model empathy, model sympathy, and model respect to it. Because again, when they feel that, they're gonna display that, not just with you, but with other peers. Don't be afraid to listen to the child's perspective. It's always frustrating when I have conversation with parents or other professionals in the field and they said, they're only 3, do they get it? Yep. Not in the same context as we do, but they get it. Listen to them, develop those healthy boundaries, normalize conversations with them about behaviors that they're displaying that you don't agree with. But don't let this be a dictatorship. Don't tell them, don't do this, don't do that, because that's not going to get you anything. That's not going to build that bond. As opposed to, let me tell you what I saw. I see bites on Brianna's shoulder. Are those your teeth? Ask intentional questions that's really going to provoke Jorge to think about the behavior, not himself, but the behavior that he's displaying. While you're doing that, don't get in a power struggle. Do not get in a power struggle. You will lose, guaranteed. And help children to understand behavior, not the guilt that comes from that behavior. Again, we are developing children. We need to find a way to help them scaffold their behavior, to help them understand this is acceptable, this is not. But it's very unfair to children when we say to them, I expect for you to listen, when you're not willing to listen to them. Here's our final reflection for the day. I got this quote. I'll get to your question in a second, Noemi. Here's a quote that was written in a book that I read from Robbins. She quoted Mr. Rogers. I know, Vicky, you can appreciate this. You do a lot of work with Mr. Rogers. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. Imagine Jorgito feeling overwhelmed with anger. Imagine Jorgito feeling so frustrated because he can't speak. Instead of him lashing out at his friends, he finds a way to talk about them because he's not overwhelmed. If you were to ask me, the way to understand children's behavior is to really understand how you see challenging behaviors. I've told my parents at the beginning of the school year, I tell my students that I teach, I tell my girls that I raise, I understand you. I really do. But I need you to help me understand you better. It changes the whole dynamic of it. I invite you to come aboard this ride, this mind shift of how we see challenging behaviors, because at the end of the day, children are going to model the behavior that they see. Children are going to distance themselves from adults that don't respect them, that don't love them, that they don't feel part of. Just as much as children are going to be receptive to your leadership, to your teaching, to your guidance, to your child rearing, if they feel loved, if they feel respected, and if they have the sense of belonging. I thank you very much for your time. I hope this was something worth for you to take home and continue to reflect on. Here are my references if you want them. You have access to this PowerPoint. You do have access to an agenda that I posted up on the portal. If there's anything that I can do to help you in the future, maybe you just want to have a conversation, maybe you just want some tips. I enjoy doing that. I enjoy helping other professionals in our field. I want us to get to the point of saying that early childhood education is the start to change society. I definitely want to be part of that, and I welcome you on board this cultural shift of behavior challenges. Thank you again. If you have any questions, please stick around. If you don't, enjoy the rest of your day. If you're participating in tomorrow's workshop, developmentally appropriate practices in the preschool classroom, then I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time. Share your email with us. Yes. You're very welcome. Let me see. There was a so Noemi, don't leave yet, Noemi. You said, how in the world do we do that? I come from a traditional Mexican family, and all we do is bring guilty. I'm assuming that's what it was. Well, let me just finish this. Here's my email. Oops. Okay, here's my email. In order for any change to happen, there needs to be an acknowledgement of change needed. I come from, like I said, I come from very traditional Mexican machismo culture that doesn't agree with a lot of things that I shared with you. And I get it, I understand that. However, the research shows something different. So the only way that I'm going to change my culture, my family members, or anyone else that wants to be on board is I have to model that. I have to be willing to say, look, you know what? Try this. I have to be willing to go out on a limb and be in a vulnerable situation to share with people that there is another way. I was raised in a home that spanking was the way of raising children, and instilling fear in them is the way that children will listen to you. I can tell you now as an adult that that's not true. That doesn't help. Specifically, if you're talking about attachment, children need to be respected, loved, and heard, and have the sense of belonging to, which is exactly what attachment is. So if you use that approach with children at a very young age, and that's what they're going to go for, that's what they're going to go to whenever they're experiencing any type of challenges, any type of struggles in their life. I think back to my teenage years and to how bad I was, really bad. Was I a gangster? Was I a tagger? Was I a rocker? What the heck? I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I just wanted to have a sense of belonging. And when my mom and dad would tell me, talk to me, Jorge, I know you're going through something, I didn't talk to them because I didn't have that sense of belonging with them. Contrary, if I have that with my girls, by the way, Brianna enjoyed the names that I use in my story, that's them. When I have that and establish that with my Brie and my Joy, I'm banking that if they're ever going through the same struggles that I went through in teenage years, they're going to come to me because they have that love, respect, and sense of belonging. It's hard. No, I mean, I get you. It's really, really hard, but totally worth it. I hope that I know that I can't give you a straightforward answer in it, but I can tell you that it'll work. You guys are very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for the support. Okay, got the email there. Thank you all. Thank you. I appreciate you guys being here. Let me see. Let's make sure I go. I can relate. Everyone is Hispanic. Alejandra, you still here? Yes, you're still here. Let me see. Thank you. You touched me there, Alejandra. Thank you so much. How can you, Hazel, I would say take a screenshot, and your screenshot should have the time. We were over at 1. You can also send me an email, then I can verify it for you. Yeah, no, I mean, I know, I know it's hard. It's hard with our children. It's even harder with grandchildren because they're not our own. But I genuinely believe that change takes a long time and it's baby steps. You can't negate those small steps that you take, and you can't get desperate with thinking that I have to get there tomorrow. Don't put a timetable on it. Just celebrate those small success that you have and continue to increment them by changing what you've learned and start learning this new approach, this shift of approach. It's not new, it's just a shift of the mind. Yeah, Noemi, así me enseñaste. Oh, yes, I've heard that so many times. You're welcome, Araceli. Ah, that's great. I'm glad you were inspired. That's awesome. Yeah, and that's, and Noemi, to your comment, my sister literally tells my mom, pues así me enseñaste, and breaks my heart. That's what you taught me. That's social learning theory. That's learned behavior. Just as much as children can learn that undesired behavior, children can also learn that desired behavior if you're reinforcing them with it. So it's hard, it's time consuming, as I've said, but it's totally worth it. You just have to be willing to understand, what am I modeling? Am I modeling that desired behavior? And if you are, then keep doing that. And the children will see that, oh, you know what, this actually has a better outcome than that undesired behavior. Easy E said it best, and I'm sorry that I'm quoting rap music, but Easy E said it: negative attention, or what would he say? Negative publicity or positive publicity, it's still publicity. And it's true with children, they don't care if it's positive or negative attention, they just want the attention. So if they've been conditioned to getting attention when they misbehave, then they're probably going to continue to misbehave to get the attention, as opposed to celebrating those small steps that they're doing. Then they're going to say, you know, this feels a whole lot better because not only am I doing the right thing, but I'm being reinforced to continue to do the right thing, which then will shift them into doing that desired behavior. Noemi's laughing at my easy quote. Thank you, Araceli. Thank you. Thank you guys very much. Like I said, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. And I hope to see you tomorrow. Tomorrow starts at 12:30. My workshop, Development in Appropriate Practices in the Preschool Classroom. You're welcome, Anna. Bye, you guys.
Thank you, Professor. See you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Justine, Tiffany, you guys have any questions? Justine, do you have any questions? Cool. Well, thank you again.